Okay, so now we're going to begin looking at the peoples and societies of the North. So we're getting out of Mesoamerica and we're moving a little bit further into what we know as the United States now. Um, so if you look on page 46, this is where we're going to be starting. So the first societies this chapter kind of gets into are the Pueblo and the Navajo, and they're in the American Southwest. And if we know anything about the American Southwest, Arizona, West Texas, and these regions are extremely hot and arid. You can't grow things in this area. So they had to rely on massive irrigation projects, not problems. And these projects were used mainly to raise maize, which is corn. 80% of their diet came from corn. A lot of this has to do with the lack of domesticated animals in this region, in the Americas, and also in Latin America, South America. They have that problem as well. So by about 700 CE, you saw these massive construction of permanent stone or adobe dwellings, and 125 of these sites have been discovered. And the Pueblo and Navajo are actually a very prominent native group in the Southwest even today. The Iroquois, which are further east in the woodlands of the Mississippi, east of the Mississippi, lived a little bit differently. They didn't live in these massive stone constructions. They lived in these wooden palisades, which were essentially like these wooden houses built. And they were also surrounded by massive walls to offer protection from invasion or rival tribes. They relied a lot on the environment from which they lived. But the main feature of these communities is mound building. And if you look up page 487, and I'll have a picture on the next slide, there's a massive a mound that was constructed at Cahokia, which is in East St. Louis, which is actually in Illinois. They served as ceremonial platforms, homes, and burial grounds. I think this structure is actually the third largest structure in the Americas, besides maybe the Temple of the Sun and a construction in the Mayans in the Yucatan. So very large structures, and some of them are still standing. A lot of them, unfortunately, have been destroyed by construction, modern-day construction. Here's a map of a lot of the North American tribes from this period in history that you can see. This is Cahokia in East St. Louis. So you can see it's quite tall. We know that there was trade going through this region because, in fact, there was no written documents from these northern cultures. They didn't have written language or anything written down record-keeping wise, so we have to rely on archaeological evidence. And we know for certain that they traded with one another because we see things that are in Mississippi that are from downriver or upriver. So we find things like seashells, copper from the Great Lakes region, and mica from the Southern Appalachian that can only be explained by trade through river routes. There's extensive trade going through this region. Also, no writing in the empires of South America, so we're moving south now. We're on page 488. Not until the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century. They would use a different form of communication, which we'll get to here in a moment. And this is in South America, not Mesoamerica. And unlike Mesoamerican cultures who had writing, who used hieroglyphics, the Mayans and the Aztecs used a form of writing by the 5th century CE. Archaeological evidence indicates that Indian societies had some, indicates that there were Indian societies. So if you look at your map on page 489, the Indian societies, Andes are on the western half of South America, and just kind of go down the western spine of the country, or of the continent. And you would see the development of massive cities. There's a list of the cities in your text, which are kind of become regional states. Chimu being one of the major ones, and Chucuito was another. So before the coming of the Incas, who we're going to look at as one of the major societies of South America, you saw the displacement of the Chavín and the Moche societies. So they would be displaced by the movement of new people into this region. And you would see these various regional states, such as Chucuito and Chimu. And they centered around Lake Titicaca, which is on the border of um, Peru and Ecuador, I believe. Or Peru and Bolivia, not Peru and Ecuador. Close. And they relied on potato cultivation. So in Mesoamerica, which is modern day Mexico, El Salvador, that region, you would see maize cultivation. Here you would see the cultivation of potatoes. Also, they relied on one domesticated large animal, which you wouldn't see anywhere else in the Americas, the llama and the alpaca. So they relied on them as their source of fur, their source of food, a pack animal so they could move stuff on a llama or an alpaca. So it was kind of their sheep, so to speak, or their cow or pig in this region. They had no ability to domesticate anything else there. Unfortunately, they weren't strong enough to carry it. You can't really ride a llama. So a lot of the South American cultures and Latin American cultures had to rely on moving by foot. The kingdom of Chimu was on the Peruvian coast, and they were a major civilization in this region as well. But we're going to move on and talk more closely about the Inca, because the Chimu would kind of emerge and develop after they fell. You would see the expansion of a new empire, the Inca, who kind of came from the valley of Cusco. So look at that. So the Inca Empire, again from the Valley of Cusco, they referred to the people who spoke the PICHU language. They settled around Lake Titicaca as well, on the kind of Peruvian and Bolivian border around this 13th century. So we're pretty far into kind of getting closer to the modern era. They expanded their territory into Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina. If you look at their map, it's pretty expansive, but they're limited in where they can move. If you know anything about South American geography, you know in the interior of South America is the Amazon rainforest, very difficult to move into. So they were really unable to expand past that, just because the coastline offered more for them financially. The population actually was up to 11.5 million people. It's quite expansive for this period in history. Again, here's a map of the Incan Empire. So the way they administered their empire, since they didn't have a written language, is they used a mnemonic aid called Quipu, and it was essentially a system of chords and knots. And if you look at the map, you can see it on 490. There's a kind of an explanation of how Quipu worked. Would be very inefficient for us today, but it was something, the way they kind of looked at how taxes they raised, property, population measures, so census type stuff. They would use Quipu to kind of establish that. So the Incas, like a lot of their Mesoamerican neighbors, relied on holding people hostage and colonization to spread their empire. So what they would do essentially is they would colonize places, and in those places they would put loyal subjects there to make sure that the people were well established and were unwilling to rebel against their empire. And it talks about that top of 490, that oftentimes if they became rebellious, they would establish garrisons there with military staff as well. Here's an example of Quipu. So Cusco was the capital of the Incan Empire. It is still a city in Peru that you still go to today. It is very high elevation, but the residents of high nobility, there were residents of high nobility, priests, people who were held hostage by the empire. A lot of the buildings were adorned with gold facades, especially those buildings which were of high importance. Buildings that were of less importance, that commoners lived in, were usually of a red brick. You kind of see like a hierarchical structure, even in the construction of their buildings. Incan roads had massive road building systems and projects throughout their empire to maintain close contact with the extent of their empire. 2 north-south roads, approximately 10,000 miles. It's quite extensive for an early civilization such as this. And if you know anything about South American geography, you look here at the Andes Mountains, which is essentially what this empire was built around. So you had to build roads through mountains and along the coast. Um, they paved the roads. They were wide, well used, are widely used by the courier service, messenger services, and they basically uh, limited long distance trade with other empires because the Incans wanted to maintain their strong hold on trade and commerce in the empire, and they didn't want anybody else benefiting from this. And again, here's a kind of example of Machu Picchu, which wasn't discovered till very, very recently in the Andes Mountains. So these cities are built at the tops of mountains. Quite difficult to do. That'll end today's lecture. We will pick up on our lecture